Fantastic. Hi, I'm Ben. This is Fantastic Network Tools and where to find them. So there's a lot of data out there around peering tools. However, a lot of the information that I want to look at when doing things like peering, although albeit my version of peering for BGP tools is different to your version of peering for networks, that let you try and figure out like who networks are. Because at the end of the day, a lot of the data turns into just ASN numbers and sometimes locations, which is not immediately the most grokkable thing to a human face. So a lot of the stuff I'm trying to figure out when looking at it is like who people are, where are they physically present, what are they hosting, are they a content network, are they eyeballs? Sometimes that's not obvious. Who are they already peering with to maybe give you a gauge of whether they're likely to peer with you. Is there anywhere that you can see if what their transit routes actually look like, what their egresses look like, and whether you actually are whether they're accepting your routes. Unfortunately, these resources are very useful, but they're very poorly documented. So that's the point of this talk. Intro and full disclosure, so I run BGP tools. So keep in mind that the BGP tools guy will at some point tell you to use BGP tools. But I'm more than happy to mention what I would, I guess, to some degree consider competitors. Most of these non-BGP tools utilities I will still use on my day-to-day stuff anyway, because I don't have those features, or it's useful to get like a cross-check. But yeah, keep in mind there is a little bit of a conflict of interest here. So the first one that I'd always recommend, and the ones you probably already know, PeeringDB. It might be one of the most fundamental data sources out there around BGP networking. Gives you, really simple access to things like, the name, expected IPv4 prefixes, which are mostly correct. When they last updated their PeeringDB page, which can be a fantastic proxy for seeing how competent a network is. And like various other useful things, including if you're trying to P&I someone or trying to see if you want to get in a direct facility with them, where they physically are, which once again is a proxy for how it is only useful if they recently update it, because a lot of the large content networks are moving quite rapidly. You can also it's one of the only data sources where you can just flat out download their entire database, which is very useful if you want to add it to your own peering tools if you have those internally. Secondly is RIS. The NCC has runs a bunch of really useful tools. I think one of the more useful ones is RIS, which is effectively a giant BGP route collector, which also provides a whole bunch of very useful tools. Perhaps the most useful one being RIS Live. You can basically open up a WebSocket to RIPE, and they will give you back in JSON a real live stream of all of the BGP updates that they're currently seeing from all of the people who are peering with RIS. That's really useful, and in fact forms the backbone of a whole bunch of utilities. So a whole bunch of companies out there that you see doing things like BGP hijack detection are actually just streaming off this WebSocket and running some scripts. So it's a really nice tool. They also provide you, traditionally they used to provide you things called MRT files. You can still do that if that's what your tools are dimensioned for, but I think a lot of people these days have migrated to this streaming JSON interface. I would advise against streaming against this interface in full pelt, given this would easily pelt out you about 100 megabits per second of JSON, which for some scripts is a little bit too much. Thankfully, RIPE does actually let you do the filtering on their side, so you can give them a target prefix or a target ASN, and they'll give you all the updates just for that thing that matches. They also give you this very useful looking glass feed. So instead of getting all the updates in real time, you can just ask how does the rest of the world's RIS peers get to me, so on a prefix by prefix basis. This can be very useful if you're just looking for an equivalent of a looking glass across many networks. It's also in JSON. This is a very useful tool. It's very poorly documented, I found, but you can find this on RIPEstat, which I'll get into later. On the same sort of theme, the sort of counterparty to root views is the University of Oregon's, the counterparty to RIS is the University of Oregon's root views. Most of the easiest way to query these things is effectively their telnet servers. They have a root collector in a bunch of the major exchanges. I think there is one on LonApp as well, or obviously joint links and LonApp connectivity. And the idea is that you, once again, like RIS, you peer with this root collector, you send your full table to it, or you send a table that you should probably send to a customer, and people can go and look up your routes in an easy way. These tools these projects are really useful because from my own experience, every single time I go to try and find a provider's looking glass page, it's one of two things. It'll either NX domain straight away or timeout, or when you go in to actually do a query, it just doesn't work. And so the nice thing about this is it gives you a very quick answer of whether the thing actually works or not, because it's an aggregator rather than a single endpoint. RIPE Atlas is perhaps the second most useful thing. that RIPE offers. So this is effectively a giant probe network. In fact, there's almost definitely people in this room who might actually just have probes or be able to give you a probe if you don't already have one. They are basically small hardware or virtual devices that you install in your networks, including potentially your home network, which would be very nice. And other people can run trace routes on it. And by running a probe, you get the rights to also run trace routes on everybody else's nodes. This is incredibly useful for debugging routing or just seeing general sanity checking the network from the outside. So if you see things like, hey, a customer is complaining that in Egypt I can't get to my website, you can actually request trace routes from Egyptian RIPE Atlas probes and see that for yourself rather than taking a customer's word for it or potentially trying to extract a trace route out of a customer that doesn't quite understand how to run trace route. This is not the only type of network, though. So there's a bunch of new people who are doing this. Global Ping is a new one. It's like RIPE Atlas. There are fewer probes on there, but it's much more tilted towards content networks. So things like AWS, Google Cloud, a bunch of hosting providers. There's a much more functional API, in my opinion, and a much more functional front end, although the RIPE utility has recently had a much long-needed upgrade for usability. The way you join these guys' networks is you just run a Docker container, so that may be good for some people. I feel like there's two kinds of people. The kind of people who says, when I say just run a Docker container, they're like, oh yeah, that'll be really simple. And there are people like me, when you say just run a Docker container, I'm like, oh Jesus Christ. There was also this other thing called mtr.tools. There's no affiliation. It's hobbyist run, it's got 150 nodes, all the testing points are realistic content providers, but the website is very slick and very nice. It's worked practically every time I've attempted to use it and gives a nice, quick, snappy, if you just need a sanity check, if you're not targeting a specific provider and you're just looking for like trace routes from some countries, this is sort of my first call. IXP data, so there's IXPDB by EuroIX, which is a fantastic tool. It's a bit of a niche. It's not like PeeringDB in where PeeringDB is PeeringDB is an aggregate of what people put into PeeringDB, rather than IXPDB is an aggregate of what IXPs tell EuroIX. So it's two different kinds of data. You will find people who don't have PeeringDB accounts or profiles, but they will show up on IXPDB. I find that sometimes, at least Russian networks, are most annoying with this, where they don't have PeeringDB accounts, but you can find them in the IXF data. But this requires that the Internet Exchange itself provides that data to IXPDB, and while most of them do through things like IXP Manager, which provides an automatic export for this, the data isn't always correct. For example, the common one is that it will claim that people have IPv6 addresses for their exchange lands when they never configured them. So there are ups and downs towards choosing whichever approach. Carrier tools. This is more of a specific shout out to HE because I think it has one of the most usable tools in this sort of subset. Giving out real-time filtering data. So HE has this really useful tool called routing.he.net where you can see what HE thinks of your peering sessions. Really useful tool. You can also go down into detail on why it filtered certain prefixes and why it accepted certain. Fantastic tool. I wish more networks had stuff like this. Yeah, more as inspiration if anyone are going into the automation side of things. And then we get to the aggregator tools. There is sort of famously bgp.he.net, which is an aggregator site for a whole bunch of data, peering status, like networks. There's a famous exchange report that some providers care a lot about who's on the most internet exchanges. There's a whole bunch of really small features on this thing, and recently they added traceroute support for global ping and perf sonar, which is sometimes very useful. The only downside to HEs is that the data is only refreshed every 24 to 48 hours, which can be a bit tedious if you're wanting real-time feedback. Another useful aggregator tool is Radar Curator. Curator is a Russian or Czech Republic DDoS mitigation company who also do BGP monitoring on the side. It's got real-time ish data. They have a strong focus on things like security issues. If you've left open DNS resolvers or you've got root loops that could potentially be exploited for DDoS amplification, if you sign up, they'll basically go and list out all those problems to you. And they also have global rankings, which some people care a lot about. There's Ripe Stat as well, which I mentioned earlier. This is sort of just like the basket case. It has the entire kitchen sink of tools. Some of them are useful, some of them are really weird, some of them are flat out broken. They recently pushed out a new UI, which I find completely unusable, but the old UI is still available and probably will be for quite some time. There are loads of information. There's lots of information in this thing. A bunch of really useful ones, including geolocation support. So if you are having customers who have issues with Netflix locating them into the wrong place, or the BBC locating them into the wrong place, the Ripe Stat might actually be able to give you an answer on which database thinks that. It also has what I think is the only functional version of BGP Play JS in existence. Risk activity graph, so you can see if your network had recently had a bit of a BGP earthquake, so to speak. And finally, because it is an RIR, it also gives nice detailed accounts of RIR transfer history. So if you're looking at IP space, potentially to buy it, you can see how many previous owners, or at least officially how many previous owners it had. Honorable mentions, there's radar.cloudflare.com. They're going recently more into the land of RipeStat for like BGP data, but it's not particularly noteworthy. The one thing that is noteworthy on radar.cloudflare.com is that you can see an estimation of Cloudflare's own traffic stats to that ASN. They won't give you actual megabits, but the graph curveness can tell you the difference between, is this 100 megabits or is this like 10, 100 gigabits? So that's nice. BGP View, it was unfortunately seemingly unmaintained now, but it was a very useful tool from 2015 to around 2019. I think they got bought by some security company, and unfortunately the site is sort of in a bit of a zombie state. But it was a very good competitor to the BGP.HEnet at the time. And in fact, it's also partly what inspired BGP tools. And then there's the absolute classic of AS rank from the Kaido people. It's a much more academic thing. It's mostly a demonstration of their ranking algorithm, but it is very popular with transit providers who like to claim that they are in the top 5 on the Kaido ranking. And finally, there's the speakers aggregator tool. I told you that at some point the BGP tools guy was going to talk about BGP tools. So I set this up in 2018 due to the frustrations with existing aggregator sites. Performs a bunch of the same functionalities as the other aggregator sites I've mentioned, but with a strong focus on mobile usability, because if you get paged, if you're at the pub, I would prefer to load those pages on my phone in a way that is readable, fast page response times, and sort of more creative data extraction from methods I think that other people perhaps wouldn't want to do. The site sustains itself on the site's own operating costs are funded by effectively selling monitoring out of its own thing. Out of its own technology, and the site runs its own BGP collector, which you should definitely peer with. I am available to peer on LonApp if that is something that you're on, which you probably are. A quick demo of like some of the useful things on BGP tools. So if you load up an exchange, gives you, first of all, it gives you vendor information, which can be very useful to figure out like sort of what scale of equipment they're running. There's a difference between peering with a Juniper device, which may be like small or huge, or peering with a MikroTik, which is probably going to be small. And also it gives you useful information around root servers, where you can see exactly what you might get if you join the root servers for a certain peer. Or alternatively, if a peer is removing you from their announcements, you can see what you would have been getting. ASN pages have a whole bunch of bits and bobs here. So you can see the prefixes, downstreams, upstreams, there are IXP ports, same stuff as the BGP stuff. If there's stuff that is sort of visibly wrong with the naming, because company names change over time, you can submit corrections directly to me, and I will probably review them in time. If the ASN has direct connectivity or direct peering with BGP tools, you can use BGP tools as a real-time looking glass, which might save you from the problem that I commonly have, which is most looking glasses run by ISPs don't actually work. Finally, you can see a whole bunch of their known BGP communities, which saves you from trying to Google it from various dubious sources. I try really hard to try and keep those up to date, and also lets you observe what communities have actually been seen and what communities are actually being used. And finally, if you're logged in, there's a whole bunch of AS-Cone analysis utilities, which may or may not be useful to you. On a prefix by prefix basis, you can see like a propagation map of like how stuff propagates out towards things like tier 1s, and a whole bunch of other things, including DNS information. If you want to go and see what hosts are inside a DNS block, what hosts are inside an IP CIDR block, BGP tools might be able to give you an answer, both on the reverse DNS and the forward DNS side of things. AS-set, BGP tools makes a bunch of effort around handling AS-sets as well. You can throw an AS-set in there and it'll relatively instantly resolve out what's in there and potentially also tell you if you're about to import the entire internet Fun fact, ASD kicks contains more ASNs than there are currently visible on the full table, including more prefixes. So you may not want to actually go and import ASD kicks into any, or you don't want to build ASD kicks and put it into your router, because you might as well just import all. And finally, like the proper looking class. BGP Tools has a lot of sessions, and if you're curious about targeting one specific thing now, you can just throw a prefix in there and get all of the sessions response in one go. This page is mostly useful if you have Control F handy, if you're looking for one specific thing, but it's also very useful to get a general vibe of how the world is trying to, what providers people are taking to get to you. And yeah, you can do this on a per session basis as well if that works better. In addition, if you link a RIPE Atlas API key, instead of having to use the RIPE Atlas's questionable UI, you can use BGP Tools' less questionable UI to start off probe measurements. And I think I actually return results faster than the RIPE Atlas website at the moment, which is, I don't know how I managed to do that. I don't know how RIPE managed to be slower, but it is what it is. That's the end of my promo. The only thing I have left is to ask you to peer with root collectors. A whole bunch of the internet and the academic world is only really possible to understand if you peer with root collectors. So my argument from the academic side is that there are a whole bunch of people who are interested in improving how the internet works on a protocol level, and it's not great if those people have incorrect data to build their algorithms with. So if you feed your BGP tables to these collectors, that eventually gets imported into these academic projects who then hopefully bring out more sane papers, because at the moment they seem to publish papers that are sometimes questionable. But that's because they're garbage in, garbage out. So I would encourage people to peer with as many root collectors as possible. And that means sending your full table as if you were sending a BGP customer a full table directly to these IXP peers, or multi-hop BGP, if that also works for you. Here's a rough breakdown of depending on what exchanges you're on and what's available. If you need it, that's the ones on the IXPs. A bunch of them also now support multi-hop BGP peering if you're capable of sending these tables over onto the internet. And yeah, I think that's roughly it. If you have the capability, you should absolutely feed an IXP root collector. It'll also help rankings on various websites. I think that's one of the best ways to bump your KIDA rank and also your BGP Tools rank, because BGP Tools also does rankings. And I think that's it. Any questions? Whoa, OK.
Hi, Niels from NLNOG. I think you may have forgotten two very nice tools.
Which ones did I forget?
NLNOG Looking Glass.
Oh, of course, sorry, yes.
IR Explorer.
IR, OK, yeah, so there is you're right, that's fair enough. So on the AS set side, there is also a great tool called IR Explorer, which gives you much more interesting detail than my tool around specific things like RPKI compliance and IRR DBs. So that's a very useful tool. And NLNOG also runs a very useful BGP looking glass, which actually seeded the beginning of BGP Tools as real-time collector. And I'm forever thankful for that, because bootstrapping those projects is really hard. Yeah, and you also join NLNOG Ring, I guess, as well. If you have the capabilities of hosting a virtual machine, the NLNOG Ring folks run a fantastic project in where if you give the project a virtual machine, you get access to all the other virtual machines on all the other providers, which is sometimes extremely useful for debugging.
Thank you very much.
Just don't do a Hurricane Electric.
Just don't start letting people randomly use those virtual machines without permission. That's bad.
Any other questions for Ben?
I think he's got a mic, or not.
So it's very hard to say this without sounding cynical, but
I'm all for cynical. Go for me.
in the interest of people understanding where stuff is from and all the rest of it, how do you make money out of this?
Yeah, so I make money through monitoring. I would prefer if people would pay me to basically monitor their ASN. So I give real-time, close to real-time alerts around if you drop off a provider or if you drop a prefix. I hope to get those alerts out in like 120 seconds, which I think is faster than the competition at the moment. But I can only make that work because people feed me BGP tables. But I sort of run a dual good for the internet and obviously for profit on monitoring.
That sounds very useful, and I'm glad to have been able to give the opportunity to plug it.
Is there another question?
Yeah, I had a question about the Looking Glass. I noticed that you've got a lot of annotations around the communities, and I was just wondering how you did that, basically.
How did I obtain all the community values, or?
Yeah, like what they do, basically.
Lots of pain and suffering. Basically, digging through a myriad of. Once again, the first initial seed came from the NLNOG project, who maintain a fantastic database of these things. And then from there onwards, I basically started going through all the other tier ones and various transit providers' knowledge base pages, and whenever I see something, I throw it in there. But also, if you go to BGP Tools and if you have signed in, you can edit your own ASN's communities and have them, show up on the looking glass, which is very useful for your own customers to understand what the hell is going on. Which I would always recommend. If you have communities, please document them on BGP Tools.
Oh, thanks.
The BGP Tools guy will tell you to use BGP Tools.
Any other questions? Well, thank you very much, Ben.
Cool. Thank you.